Imagine you're a North Vietnamese soldier in the jungle in 1968. You hear jets overhead. You expect something terrifying, a Mach 2 Phantom screaming across the sky. Instead, what shows up is something that looks like it escaped from a flight school parking lot. It's tiny, it's slow, and it's flying so low you can almost read the pilot's name on the canopy. And then the jungle erupts. Bombs, rockets, a nose-mounted Gatling gun that sounds like a buzzsaw tearing through the trees. That little airplane was a Cessna A-37 Dragonfly. And in Vietnam, the pilots who flew it had a nickname for their jet. They called it the Super Tweet. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. When most people think about the air power used in the Vietnam War, they picture the big, glamorous jets. The F-4 Phantom. The F-105 Thunderchief. Well, maybe not that one. That's a whole nother topic. Massive machines built for speed and power. But the war in Southeast Asia created a strange problem. Those jets were too fast. Targets were hidden under thick jungle canopy, and by the time a supersonic fighter spotted something on the ground, it was already miles past it. Meanwhile, the older propeller-driven attack planes, like the legendary A-1 Sky Raider, were getting hammered by ground fire. So the Air Force needed something different. Something that could fly low, slow, and precise. And oddly enough, the answer came from a training airplane. The Air Force looked at the Cessna T-37, a small twin-engine jet used to train new pilots. It was affectionately called Tweety Bird, and it was about as intimidating as the name suggests. The airplane sat so low to the ground you didn't even need a ladder to climb in. Pilots joked that getting into it felt more like stepping into a convertible Corvette than a military jet. But engineers at Cessna saw potential. They ripped out the original engines and replaced them with two General Electric J-85 turbojets, nearly doubling the thrust. Then they reinforced the wings to carry 8 hardpoints for bombs and rockets. Finally, they mounted a 7.62mm mini Gatling gun in the nose. Just like that, Tweety Bird became the A-37 Dragonfly, and pilots who flew it gave it a new nickname, the Super Tweet. Not everyone in the Air Force was impressed. The hotshot fighter pilots flying Phantoms and Thunderchiefs mocked the little jet mercilessly. They called it the Mattel Marauder, as if it were a cheap plastic toy airplane. One A-37 pilot, Robert Macaluso, summed it up perfectly. If the airplane isn't fast and doesn't wow all the girls, then the airplane doesn't count. The Super Tweet didn't have much clout. It wasn't glamorous. And it certainly didn't look like a war machine. But the people who really mattered loved it. The forward air controllers directing strikes from above the airfield, and the soldiers on the ground who depended on accurate air support. Because the A-37 had something the big jets didn't: precision. The Super Tweet flew about 100 miles an hour slower than the swept-wing fighters. That gave pilots time to line up their targets. Bombing accuracy was often within 45 feet of the aim point, which, in jungle warfare, was practically surgical. One forward air controller was so relieved during a mission that he blurted out over the radio, "Thank God, now I have someone who can actually hit the damn target." But because the A-37 started life as a trainer, it also came with some, let's call them, interesting design quirks. First, the cockpit wasn't pressurized, so when the pilot fired the nose-mounted minigun, he literally smelled the gunpowder in the cockpit. And during mid-air refueling, if the tanker's fuel basket leaked, raw JP4 jet fuel could run down the windshield, drip through the canopy seal, and land directly in the pilot's lap. Just another day at the office. Then there was the minigun flash problem. The blast deflector vented gases upward to keep the engines from choking. Great for engines. Terrible for pilots. At night, every burst from the gun created blinding flashes right in front of the cockpit. It completely destroyed the pilot's night vision. The official solution? There wasn't one. Instead, pilots developed their own technique. They'd squeeze one eye shut before firing the gun. Then, open the good eye so they could actually see the jungle when pulling out of a dive. The A-37 also sat incredibly low to the ground, which meant the engine intakes acted like giant vacuum cleaners on the runway. To prevent debris from getting sucked into the engines, the aircraft used retractable intake screens while taxiing. Even with the screens, things got interesting. One rainy night, a crew chief stood a little too close to an A-37 during engine startup. His rain poncho got sucked flat against the intake screen. He couldn't move. He just stood there, pinned to the jet, until the engine RPM dropped low enough for him to peel himself off. Maintenance crews also had a favorite prank. They'd quietly flip off the emergency engine ignition switch under its red safety cover. Then they'd close the cover so it looked normal. The pilot would climb in and try to start the engine. Nothing. After a few confused attempts, the pilot would slam the red cover down in frustration, which automatically flipped the switch back on. The flooded engine would suddenly ignite, gauges spinning, and a 20-foot flame blasting out the tailpipe, usually accompanied by the sound of laughing crew chiefs on the ramp. Then there was the Air Force's attempt at camouflage. A few A-37s were painted powder blue to help hide them from ground fire. From below, it didn't work. They took just as many hits as before, but from above, the blue paint worked too well. Forward air controllers couldn't see them. Wingmen lost sight of them in the sky. And those powder blue jets often returned to base, still carrying their bombs, because no one could find them. Despite all the quirks the Super Tweet provided to be incredibly tough, one pilot, Bob Chapelier, accidentally clipped the top 15 feet off a tree while flying low over Cambodia. The impact crushed the leading edge of his wing. Napalm splashed across his aircraft. For a moment, he considered ejecting, but both engines were still running, so he shrugged and flew the mangled jet home. The A-37 also had something no other Air Force jet was allowed to do. Pilots could shut down one engine in flight to conserve fuel. That allowed the Dragonfly to orbit over a battlefield much longer than faster jets. For troops on the ground, that extra loiter time could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The Super Tweet pilots also developed a reputation for aggressive flying, which led to some legendary radio calls. Rap 21 in hot. No joy rap, where you in from? Straight up. The controller paused, then replied, "Ah, okay, cleared hot." The pilot had just dive-bombed the target out of an aerobatic loop. The Dragonfly proved so effective that after the fall of South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese captured 33 intact A-37s and used them against their former allies. Some were even flown during Vietnam's war with China in 1979. Not bad for a converted trainer. Today, if you want to see one of these little jungle fighters up close, you can still find a few of them scattered across museums around the country. When I visited the Maps Air Museum in North Canton, Ohio, I was surprised to find a Super Tweet sitting outside in their display area. At first glance, it looked exactly like an A-37 Dragonfly, small, squat, and clearly built for business. But the story behind that particular airplane is actually a little different. The aircraft on display there started life as a T-37 trainer built by Cessna in 1956. It spent years teaching new Air Force pilots how to fly jets before eventually being retired and passed along to museums. In 2022, the restoration team at MAPS cosmetically converted it to represent an A-37B Dragonfly, the combat version that flew in Vietnam. Today it's painted to represent the aircraft assigned to the 757th Special Operations Squadron at Youngstown Air Reserve Station, not too far from where the museum sits today. Standing next to it, one thing becomes immediately obvious. This thing is small. You understand instantly why fighter pilots used to joke that the Super Tweet looked more like a toy than a warplane. But looks can be deceiving, because this little jet became one of the most effective close air support aircraft of the Vietnam War. Between 1967 and 1974, the A-37 flew over 160,000 combat sorties, and only 22 American aircraft were lost. It never got the Hollywood treatment. It wasn't fast. It wasn't glamorous. And it certainly didn't impress the fighter jocks. But in the jungles of Southeast Asia, that tiny jet provides something important. You don't always need Mach 2 heavy metal to win a fight. Sometimes, all you need is a 6,000-pound dog whistle with a Gatling gun on the nose. And that wraps up another tale from Aviation's Stranger Side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.